John Andrew Weaver. I use A for my writing because, John Weaver is like being called John Smith, especially where I'm from, which is Eastern Pennsylvania. And in my hometown, it's about 8,000 people. There's about 3 pages of Weavers, and there's about a half a page of John Weaver. So very common name. And I wanted to make sure that I wasn't confused, with other Weavers, which still happens if you go on Google Scholar. All the other John Weavers show up when you put in my name.
There was a John Weaver in the news recently, wasn't there?
Isn't that great? Isn't that great? Yeah, it was for harassment, and he was a McCain, what do they call him, advisor.
Advisor, okay.
So it wasn't me.
I saw it though.
But yeah, I looked at it. I looked at their story. I said, "Oh, great!"
Right, doing the name proud.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be me because I would never go by John Weaver. I would go by John A. Weaver, and I'm called John because I was conceived in November of 1963, and that's when John Kennedy was shot. And my father said to my mother in Woolworths, when it was announced, if it's a boy, we're going to call him John. And then Andrew, because my great uncle Andrew was a hard worker and really took it really father. So,
And Weaver because
the accident of birth. I very easily could have been by genetics and geography. I could have been a Chapman or a Morris, but I'm a Weaver. So.
I'm a Chapman because of Ellis Island, not really Ellis Island, but that kind of thing. It's not a very Jewish name, is it, Chapman? It's pretty English. So, but it was some kind of unpronounceable Ukrainian something.
Yeah, I'm sure mine was Marinsky or Moretsky or different. Yeah, I'm sure it was something different.
Well, Dan, you probably came from Spain and then ended up in Eastern Europe when you were blamed for the plague and other.
Yeah. Who was the Tsar in the late 19th century? Nicholas II, who was killed.
Nicholas, competent. So.
He was killed, and Jews were blamed, and it was a good time for Jews to leave. So my ancestors took that.
So what's changed? Instead of czars, we call them presidents.
Right.
Because you're blamed for lasers.
I want one of those though. Those look cool. Where do you get one?
I haven't found mine yet. They haven't told me about it.
Where is it?
I'm not religious enough.
I've been visiting Barry and Teresa for years now, and I still haven't found that damn laser.
Yeah. So what's your, how did you get started in curriculum studies or just your intellectual journey?
Well, I'll start with this story, and then I'll get to that. There was a time at Bergamo when, we used to take a lot of our students, and Bill Reynolds was about, the genealogy lineage of people, Marla with Bill and him with Bill. And then some students said, well, what about John? And Bill said, he's adopted. And I thought that was appropriate and accurate. So, I started at the University of Pittsburgh as a European history major, a German history major. I was going to do my dissertation on the history of 19th century German statistics.
That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it was actually interesting. I taught myself to read Gothic German because most of those studies were written in Gothic German. That was what you did in the 19th century if you were an academic. I guess that meant you were scholarly when you were able to write in this dead style. And so I was working with Fritz Springer, but it was just a dreadful experience in the history department at Pitt. Fritz Springer was a great guy, but a lot of the other professors would play politics, and they would say things. If you finish and get a job, you probably won't get one. If you finish, you probably won't get a job, and things like that. And they said, if you want to keep your assistantship, you need to get at least A minuses. But if you want an A minus, take an incomplete and rewrite this paper. I said, well, how can I keep my assistantship if I'm going to get an incomplete, which is not an A minus, but I need an A minus to keep my assistantship? So I said no, and I by accident, which is a theme I think in my life. By accident, I came across this student who was in one of Fritz Springer's class. She said, "Why don't you come to comparative education? I'll introduce you to my advisor, Mark Ginsburg." And that's exactly what she did. And within a semester, I was in comparative education, and I haven't looked back. And so at Pitt, I've told you too this story numerous times. At Pitt, you had to take 3 required courses. One was on administrative theory. I took that with David Plank, who was a University of Chicago economist. And I had a political economy class with him too. It was me and another guy, and we went back and forth about economic theory, and I loved it.
Was he steeped in Milton Friedman?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He was a Friedman Becker guy, and you can look at him now. He's still an advocate. He's at Stanford now, and he's still an advocate for school choice and trying to rationalize that bullshit. And then I had to take a class on education and culture, and that's where I was introduced to social capital and cultural capital in Pierre Bourdieu. And then I had to take a class on educational research. I took that with Mark Ginsburg, and then after that, I was on my own. I could take whatever I wanted to.
How many credits did you have to take?
99.
Okay.
I ended up with 120 some. I just kept taking classes. So, and finally Mark said, "I think you're done." And it was the same with my dissertation. I just kept on writing, and here's a draft, Mark, read this. And I kept on writing. He said, "Okay, I think you can defend." And so I defended.
That's old school. That's the way it used to be, right?
Yeah.
Freedom to take whatever you want. Now, when I was at LSU, it wasn't that way. It was pretty scripted by then. I mean,
Well, I had a great class. My very first class, first semester in history was awesome. It was the history of the American city and statistics. And so we did, and this is back in the day when you had to do those stupid SSPSX programs. They were a pass to do. If you forgot a comma, it was all analog too. If you forgot a comma, it would throw the whole thing. And so we would spend hours trying to figure out what we missed. And it usually ended up being a comma or something to get the data. But the stuff we read, I still have it stuff. It's really good stuff. And I remember one book was the City at Work and at Play, and it took the memoirs of people like the Marx Brothers and Milton Berle, and talked about living and growing up in New York City as a kid, and how rough it was and how terrible it was. In Pittsburgh, I remember history of Pittsburgh where, people who stayed at home, mostly women, cleaning the house, it was impossible. You could sweep the house in the morning, and because of the soot from the steel, it would be dirty and grungy by the afternoon, and you have to sweep again. It was just a very terrible life.
And I think Pittsburgh too was pretty rough,
Yeah.
I mean, not the same, maybe not in the same way that New York was, but.
Oh no, it was very rough. I remember the cathedral learning, Dan, and the Carnegie Museum. It was black.
Right.
And I thought that was the color of the stone that they used.
Right. Yeah.
I remember that too.
They power washed it, and it was white.
And it was white. The whole city became white. My high school, while I was in high school, I graduated in '88. They were power washing the high school. And I remember my creative writing teacher, Mr. Mayer, right? Because they would put this plastic sheeting over the windows to protect the windows. And he'd be like, "I feel like I'm inside a dime bag." And only us, drug users would get the reference.
Well, yeah. And that was the whole city. And I remember too, when you go from the east under to Squirrel Hill Tunnel, there's these 2 huge hills.
Right.
Turns out they're not geographically natural. They're slag heaps.
They're slag heaps.
No.
And
they just dumped the stuff there.
Yeah.
No.
And now they built like gated communities, really fancy homes on these slag heaps. And they're trying to grow gardens on these slag heaps and grass. And how much, the amount of chemicals they need to keep up that illusion.
Yeah. To me, it's a fascinating history. And it's the history that got me at Pittsburgh. And by '91, Mark introduced me to the Socialist Workers' Party. They came on campus, and I talked to them, and I was involved with them from 1991 to 2001 when I came here. And, you know, I always joke here in Statesboro, the closest thing to a socialist is a moderate Republican, and there's no moderate Republicans in Statesboro. But I would go to any strike and walk the picket line with strikers in Pittsburgh, Akron, York. I remember going to York in a Caterpillar strike, and it was a 4-lane highway, and the state police were there, and we surrounded the state police, and they gave up. They didn't want to control us, but Caterpillar would run a truck across the 4-lane highway because both their factory was on both sides, just to torment us.
Really?
And you know, they tormented the workers there, and it was unfair, it was unjust, and I didn't want to be a part of that injustice. I wanted to be part of the side where, you know, as the strikers would say, we don't want a piece of the pie, we just want the crumbs. You know, so I would go to these strikes. I remember going to a coal miner strike, the teacher strike was the worst thing, because they were squirting the teachers with super soakers that were coming out in the mid-90s. And the parents would saying things like, "Get back to work, you motherfuckers." And I would be like, "Who are those people?" And they say, "Oh, they're the parents." And the kids were, and this was, Dan, this was Upper St. Clair, or what's the
Mount
other?
Lebanon?
Yeah, Mount Lebanon. It was one of those. I can't remember which one it was. The only thing they wanted is they wanted parity. You know, Upper St. Clair was getting some salary, and Mount Lebanon wanted the same salary, or reversed. And so these were upper middle class
Yeah.
and the kids had complete disrespect for the teachers. The parents had no respect for the teachers, but they would piss in the water for the super
Right.
soak with the teachers.
This is the part of country that gave America Trump.
And Rick Santorum.
Yeah, and Rick Santorum.
Yeah, and that was, you know, that's the side of Pittsburgh I never wanted to be involved in, but I wanted to be involved with the Socialist Workers Party, because, man, they also knew their marks. They knew their marks better than I did, or any student I knew, because admitted, these people were mostly college educated people, and they quit their jobs and joined some union to work in some factory because they wanted to talk to the workers. And so they got me involved in all these strikes. I remember going to coal miners, the Caterpillar strike, which was United Auto Workers, steel workers, a lot of strikes.
How did they find you?
Through Mark Ginsburg and coming on campus.
Okay.
And so I just got involved. And they had an office in the North Hills, a bookstore. They had the Militant was the newspaper. And I remember, that reminds me too, I remember bringing in Alabama steelworkers who stayed at my house because they were on strike. And we raised money for them.
Yeah.
So I love doing that stuff. But then, you know, so I do my dissertation. It was on the East German university system during the Wende, during the transition, the reunification. And so I'm over there. I was over there 3 times interviewing historians, West German historians and East German historians who were involved in the transition.
How was your German at the time?
What's that?
How was your German, or were these interviews in English?
Oh, they were in both. I could easily read German. I could speak it okay. I had 7 years of it. And then, you know, I focus mostly on reading because that's, you know, it's easy to read academic German because it's the formal language. It's formal, like formal English. It's High German. So it's easy to read it and understand it. I was probably reading like 7 to 8 pages an hour in German. And if you know, I don't know if it's European presses, but German presses, you know, if we get this much in a page, you know, they'll get this much in a page because they print smaller.
Mhm.
So I thought I was doing fine. And so I let it up to the people I was interviewing, and most of them spoke English. Some of them were here. And as soon as I found out that an East German historian, for instance, was in the United States, I would go to them. And I interviewed any American historian who was involved in the transition as well. So I do my dissertation, and Mark Ginsburg is my chair. And then there's a guy named John Weidman, who's a comparative education person. And then a woman in the German department, Sabine von Derke, you know, and then Noreen Garman was the 4th person. I had her for a class in qualitative research, which is an elective that I could take, and I did take. And then I also took her for the rhetorical turn, where I read in rhetoric. And in my last book on science, an interlude, The Fault of Noreen Garman. She's the one that introduces me to rhetoric and how I use it in dealing with science. And so she was on.
Was John Weidman, was he related to the author, John Edgar Wyman?
Not that he was another University of Chicago educated person. He was a Fulbright scholar interested in German education as well.
Okay.
And so I defend my dissertation, and they say, we think this would be a good book. And I said, oh, really? That's the first anyone's ever mentioned anything like that to me. And so Noreen Garman hugs me. And by that time, I already knew I was going to LSU Shreveport. And so she hugs me and she says, we're so glad you got a job, John. We were starting to think that none of our students were going to get a job. And then she says, look up the two Bills. And then that was, of course, Bill Pinar and Bill Dahl. And so, I was 5.5 hours away from Baton Rouge, which is, another way of saying I was on an island and Bill were in culture. Because, the culture of Louisiana is not northwest Louisiana, it's the south part of the state. And so I get there, and this department is filled with a lot of people that were there about 20, 25 years. And I didn't know who Joe Kincheloe was at the time, but people would go up to me and I could tell whether they liked Joe Kincheloe, who was there from 82 to 89. I could tell, and this is 1994, I could tell how they liked him or didn't like him. They would say things like, hey, you look like Joe Kincheloe. or they would say, you look like Joe Kincheloe. Okay, all right, sorry. So I got to the point, I said, who is this guy? They're reading Joe Kincheloe. I said, this guy's good. And what he did, it's Joe Kincheloe, he's a go-getter. What he did is he organized students in the Shreveport area to take doctoral classes under the umbrella of the LSU Baton Rouge program. And so he got to know Bill Pinar very well. And he was feeding them students at the meantime, teaching classes for them. So they would take 3 or 4 classes with Joe, and then they would go down to Baton Rouge and finish their program. Susan Edgerton was one of them. And so she started with Joe Kincheloe and then ended up with, I don't know who she studied with at the Baton Rouge program, but she ended up there. And then, and so I was going to teach that class. And so teach those classes and take over what Joe did, 4 years before I was there. And so I go down to Baton Rouge and I introduce myself, and Bill Pinar sponsors me to get graduate school status. And so I get that, but, and then Bill Dole comes up to my classes and he's one that tells me I should go to Bergamo. And that's where I start going to Bergamo. And that's where I meet Marla and Toby, and the first Bergamo in Tennessee. Remember we went out to dinner with Lance and Marshall?
Yeah.
And Bill Dole drove me. You remember that?
No.
Yeah, he drove me there. And I knew nothing about Mary and Bill at the time. He just drove me. And he might have told me when I was in the car. I can't remember, but I didn't know anything because, I was new to all of this.
Yeah, I remember the first time I met you, you had long hair.
Yeah, that's why people are saying you look like Joe
Kincheloe. But you don't look like Joe Kincheloe.
No.
Oh.
But they hated him. A lot of them hated him because he was intellectual. I remember he told me one time he went to a department party and he brought beer because, it's a party. And at the end of the day, the guy's house, Larry Marshman was his name. He was a special education professor. And he says to Joe, he says, hey, can you take the beer out of the trash and take it with you? I don't want my neighbors to think I drink beer.
What? That's insane. I don't understand that culture.
And so then there was a guy named Sabin. I can't remember his first name, but he was from Minnesota. And his office was directly across from mine. He literally took my arm and pulled me into his office. And he said, John, you got to get out of this place. This is my first year. And then at the end of my first year, our department chair comes in and says, there's no raises this year. There's no raises this year. And I'm like, what? And so I started talking to the old people and they're like, when's the last time you had a raise? And they're like, 6, 7 years. I can't remember. I was like, okay, I'm out. And so the next year I applied for a job at the University of Akron. And I get that job in mid-year, and they said, well, when can you start? And I said, well, I'd like to finish my contract and finish out the year at Shreveport. They said, we'd like you to come in January. I said, okay. So I'm there. That's why I spent 5.5 years there, because I went mid-year. And that was my first good raise. I got a $5,000 raise from changing jobs, and we went back to the Northeast, which was nice. Because that's where we're from, and that's where I like to live, and that's where we want to retire too. But one more story. At Shreveport, the very first week that I'm there, I invite the Socialist Workers Party from Houston to come and have a table and talk about the militant, talk about the books. They published a lot of Malcolm X, CLR James, and a lot of other people. And so they have their booth, and they stayed at my house. And at the end of the day, we have dinner. I said, how'd it go? They said it went great. The students were interested. They asked a lot of questions. Would like to come back. The next day, I'm in my department chair's office, and she says, John, you don't want to get the reputation of being a campus radical. And I said, I don't. But it shows you how quickly word passed. It was a very conservative campus in a very conservative part of Louisiana, still is. Probably the last time they elected a Democrat was probably in the 30s. And so it was a very conservative part, and the professors were the same way. That's why I always laugh when people say, there are radicals on campus. I said, really? I'd like to meet them. Because most professors are conservative, and most of them don't want to admit it, but most of them are conservative. They like being radical out on, outside of the university, but when it comes to changing the university, they say, oh no, we can't do that, because they might have to change.
Yeah.
And we see that in our.
They're scared of confronting power, just the way, that's why societies don't change, and that's why universities have become so top heavy.
Yeah, they're typical pensioners. That I got my pension. I don't want to risk anything. My life is set. Thank you very much. Life is good.
Pensioners. I like that. I've never seen so many people run away after 30 years. Like, I never understood that. 30 years, boom, they run, they're gone. And I'm like, but you're only 55 years old. Where are you going? What are you doing? And what happened to your commitment to the intellectual life, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the university, as problematic as it is, it gives you a home to do intellectual work, and you actually get paid to do the very thing that you love. And they run away as fast as they can. And I'm like, I don't understand that. I wrote an article one time, and I said, I'm going to die in the classroom. I'm going to teach till I die in the classroom, right?
I'm going to die in my office reading a book.
Somebody's going to come get you. The lizard man, they're going to come get you.
I'm gone in weeks. Maybe he is dead.
But that's the thing, John. Like, this whole thing about the system in Georgia where you can do the 30-year thing, which when I first came here, I'm like, no way, because I thought, I'm not staying here.
Yeah, I didn't.
Why would I change my TIA craft to this Georgia thing? I'm like, are you out of your mind? I'm not staying here. Well, I've been here 20 years, but right. even if I thought I was going to stay, which I never thought I would never do that. Like 30 years, boom, I'm gone. I mean, people can't get out of here fast enough. We don't have anybody in our department who's over 55. Like they run away. Like, run away. I mean, I know there are problems, but it's like the Simpsons or whatever that cartoon.
Well, I knew I didn't want to do the retirement system because I couldn't take that money with me, and I wanted to do what I did, with Villanova and give it away, and I couldn't do that. So
you want to talk about that a little bit, like what you did with Villanova?
Well, yeah, I could do that. First of all, you got to know my background. I do not come from an academic family. I was the first person in my extended family, meaning cousins, aunts and uncles, second cousins, third cousins, it doesn't matter. I was the first person in 1982 to go to college in my family. How
did they make a living?
Well, my father was a teamster at a potato chip factory. And then they went bankrupt, and it was all downhill. They went bankrupt because the son of the owner who built up that business with the work of hard workers, built it up, and then the son drank the profits away. And so they went bankrupt. My dad lost his pension, and this was 1979. It was the wrong time to have a 10th grade education and no college degree. And my dad never recovered and for a lifestyle that he was used to, which was making about at that time probably like $30,000 a year. My stepfather and my mother combined never made more than $40,000 a year. My mom worked in a ribbon factory, and she always told me that anytime the workers there said that they were tired of it and they wanted to form a union, the company said, "We're moving." And then my stepfather worked for W.R. Grace, which started in shipping, got into chemicals, and that's what my father worked for, a chemical plant, dealt with some kind of chemicals in Quakertown, Pennsylvania, and he worked there all his life, and now has the health concerns because of it, which of course they deny that they ever were started there at that company. And so all of my family were working class people. And I knew, in the late 70s and 80s, I couldn't get a job like that because they weren't around. So what was I going to do? And, my 10th grade year, because my stepfather drank and because I was bullied in 9th grade, I left and lived with my father and went to another school. And I was a mess. I didn't go to school most of the time because it didn't take me long to figure out that I was the last to leave in the morning and the first to come home, and I just wouldn't go to school. And one time, the school, Upper Perkiomen High School, asked me to take, I don't know if you remember these white slips, permission slips for excuses that you had to take and get signed. Well, I forged my dad's signature, and that's the last I ever was asked about it. And so I probably missed in between 30 to 40 days my 10th grade year. And I had the grades to prove it. If I liked the class, I would get A's and C's. If I didn't like the class, I would get D's. I should have failed geometry, but the teachers were nice. There was a student teacher who became a friend later on in life. She also was nice, and they passed me with a D. And then, but after that year, my stepfather stopped drinking, so I moved back with my mother and my stepfather. And I said, "What am I going to do with my life?" And it was actually the beginning. It was a tough question to ask for a 16-year-old, but it was the beginning of my work habit. I just said, I'm going to go to college, and from Sunday night to Thursday night, I'm going to study 3 hours a night, whether I have something to do or not. And I took those habits into college, and then eventually into graduate school, where I was reading 60, 70 hours a week when I got into graduate school. And I still try to maintain that. And that's why I read so much today. Is because I foolishly thought that's what academics do, that. But I'm glad I developed that habit. But it was a habit because I was naive and because I didn't know what professors did, because there was no one around me that told me this is what professors do. Right. But remember, I guess it was my senior year, early my senior year. I remember my school counselor, Mr. Denglinger, and how's that for a German name? Denglinger. He said, "Well, what do you want to go to college?" I said, "I want to study history." He said, "What do you want to do with that?" And that pissed me off. That angered me. And I said, "I don't know." He said, "The only thing you could do with that is be a professor." I said, "Well, then I want to be a professor."
So you're a professor out of spite for Mr. Denglinger.
I'll show you, fucker.
In your study, reading a book. He doesn't want me to do this. He wants me to fail. I'm going to keep reading. Bastard.
Yeah. So again, I remember vividly. This is in the north, so your houses are elevated by steps because the snow gets high. And so we had like 5, 6 steps, and we were elevated about 5 feet. And so I get home, I open the mailbox. This was October 1981. I open it up. It's from Alderson Broaddus College in Philippi, West Virginia. And I knew I wanted to go to West Virginia because of a football game, the Backyard Brawl in 1975, my 6th grade year, and West Virginia beat Pitt. And they showed the rivers and they showed the mountains. I said, "That's pretty." And I just said, I want to go to college there. And it's in my yearbook. I said, I'm going to West Virginia. So, and so
Who's likely to go to West Virginia?
yeah, I'm going to West Virginia, damn it, because my counselor said I couldn't. So I get this letter, I get accepted. I jump off the porch. I chase my best friend down the street and I yell at him, I made it, I made it, I made it. And so I go back home into the house and I told my mom, I said, I got accepted. And she said, not congratulations, we're proud of you. She said, how are you going to pay for it? And so I'm dealt with this problem. How am I going to pay for this? And back then, this was a private school, but back then Alderson Broaddus was, when I was a freshman, it was like $4,400 a year. And then by the time I was a senior, it was $8,000 a year. So it was very manageable.
Yeah.
But when you're barely making $30,000-$40,000 a year, two member family working class people, that's a lot of money. And so my senior year, it had to be in the fall of '81. We had career day. And so there was myself and 4 of my friends, and together we were a danger to society. We were not, like everyone else in the 70s and early 80s, dope smokers. We didn't do that. We didn't drink either, like a lot of our classmates. We just raised hell. And when we were together, we raised holy hell. We did a lot of damage with eggs and snowballs and things like that. So we got together and we said, my 5 friends, 4 of us were going to college. We knew it. The 5th one already knew his dad owned a trucking company. So he went to tech school and he was going to be a truck driver and repair diesel engines. So we thought our lives were set. And so we go in together and we say, what don't we want to do? And we had to pick 2 things. One, I can't remember what the other one was because it had nothing to do with my life. But the other one, we all said, let's go to the Marine Corps recruiter.
No.
Yes. So it goes back to when I said a lot of things that I do in my life end up because of accident by happenstance. And so we go in and we're late because we don't give a shit. He's talking. He has this high and tight haircut. He has what we called in the Marine Corps birth control glasses. And when I first heard that, I said, "What the hell does that mean?" They said, "With those glasses, you're never getting a date." So,
oh my God! Cut that! Cut!
it's my friend openly in front of him laugh at him while he's talking, and so we go back in the room. And my friends are just talking. And I'm starting to feel sorry for this guy. I said, we're being disrespectful for him. And he's professional. And so, this is back in the 80s. And, there's no draft anymore, but you still had to fill out your selective service card. So he hands these out. And so at the bottom of it, it says, if you want more information about the Marine Corps, check yes. And so my friends out loud say, no, 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 no. And so I felt sorry for the guy because I knew he was hearing us. And so I put yes. And the next morning, he's calling the next morning. And it must have been a Saturday. So it must have been Friday where they had career day. And, my Saturday mornings were sacred. That's college basketball. And when I was a younger kid, that's cartoon time. That's free time. And he's calling me. And I'm like, wait. I'm going to college. I want money for college. He said, I can help you out. And it turned out it wasn't really a lot of help, but I graduated from high school in June of '82, middle of June, because, it's the North. You start after Labor Day, and because of snow days, you're going into June. And so the next day, he was there at about 5 or 6 in the morning and taking me off to Philadelphia to go to Parris Island. And that's where I spent my summer between my high school senior year and my college freshman year. And I was a week or 2 late for college because I graduated 9 September 1982 from boot camp. And I remember the first week I was there, I had no hair. And so two of my classmates came up to me after class and they said, "Do you have cancer?" I said, "No, I'm in the Marine Corps."
That's so funny.
So I always say it's the dumbest thing I did and the smartest thing I ever did because, you think about, we have our PhDs and we probably had 50 to 60 professors over the lifetime of our academic career. and we've had a lot of good teachers. But my senior drill instructor was a really good teacher, and he taught me a lot that I still fall back on and think about. And more importantly, what they did is exactly what we should be doing as professors. They got me to do more than I ever thought was possible for me to do. And that's what we should be doing as professors. And coaches do it too, but coaches in society get a lot of leeway. We don't. Most of our students don't look at us and say, push me, tell me I can do more. Our good students do, but most of our students are like, no, push me through.
Right.
So
what exactly do you want? I'm going to jump through these hoops, but not challenge me, not, force me to be creative. And the administration doesn't either. So we get it from the bottom. I wouldn't expect really the students to ask for that, but I would expect the administration and the professors to hold a certain standard and say, this is what we do. This is what the university is about. And you either are going to step up to the challenge or you won't. And it's fine.
Yep.
You don't have to do this.
Marlon and I have talked a lot about this. Richard Hofstadter's book, Anti-Intellectualism in America is correct. It comes from religion, it comes from other areas, but it's always been outside of the university. And I always ask people, what happens when the anti-intellectuals are running the university? And this is exactly what's happening. They're anti-intellectuals. They want to avoid reading. They want to avoid thinking. They just want to jump through the state mandated hoops, and they want to please the politicians and business leaders who don't know a damn thing about higher education and don't care about higher education. They just want cheap workers coming from the university.
Mm-hmm. It's all, it's just a absurd creation to them, that we have these student credit hours or some kind of number. We have grades, and we want it to dock it on a chart so that it's going up like profits. Instead of actually understanding what the educational process is. But anyways, you were telling us about your recruiter, or not your recruiter, but your drill instructor who taught you a lot of good lessons.
He was a truck driver from Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
He was a truck driver, and he took no shit. But he wasn't brutal. He wasn't sadistic. If we did something wrong, we were going to pay for it. If we did something right, he was going to say, "Good job." And I respected his ethic. I remember one time when a brigadier general came. We called it the pit. It was outdoors, and you weren't going to be able to feel your arms and legs when you were done. They were going to, what we said, PT you, physical training, until you dropped. I remember a brigadier general came by, and my senior drill instructor was locked and cocked. And yes, sir, no, sir, yes, sir, no, sir. And he came over to us and he said, the brigadier general said that I need to take you back up into the squad bay, and that's what we're going to do, but you don't deserve it. And so we went up out of the public's eye, and he took care of us. So, but he taught us, I think, I look back, he taught me well. He taught me how to push myself. He taught me how to expect more from myself and to get it.
And you, so you were in the Marine Corps as like a reserve, or did you have to do like active duty? Or
in 7 years, I did 2 years of active duty, but that was in the summers. That was boot camp, that was infantry training school, and that was my maneuvers that I had to do every summer. And so in that 7 years, I did 2 years of active duty, which, to put it in perspective, that means that I was not a citizen. I was governed by the military code of justice, of conduct, code of conduct, which means if I screwed up in that time, I wasn't going back to college. I was going to the brig. And I didn't want to do that.
right.
There were people in my unit that just disappeared and stopped going. And I was like, why would you go through that hell of boot camp and then decide that you don't want to show up anymore? It just didn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
But that's what people did.
There was a student who just last week, he said he was former military, and he said that if you got a sunburn when you're in the military, they like fine you or dock you for destruction of government property. So his body was
Yeah.
considered government property when he was in the military.
We called it office hours, which meant that if you were disciplined, you'd lose a month's pay. And you know, for a college kid, that was $100. And that's why I don't have a tattoo on my body, because if I got a tattoo, I could have gotten office hours, especially if I affected and I couldn't do something. Then trouble. So I will say this though, you know, if this is back in the Reagan years where drug testing in the military took place. When I was in college, that's the only time I ever smoked weed. If I was caught, if I was drug tested, which I was, if I was tested that month, I would have gotten office hours for testing positive. So, and I would have lost my pay. But I took that risk. But I didn't take that risk with the tattoo. So,
That's permanent.
yeah, that's right. Well, weed. Well, I wish weed were permanent. It mellowed me out, and I liked it. So, but the topic of you know, so I go to this college and I have an absolute blast in everything I do. My social time, my academic time, they prepare me well to go to graduate school. And I never in my life had a class with more than 25 people in it, because I went to a small liberal arts college, and then when you get to graduate school, you have very few people in there, you know, to begin with.
Right.
That made me prepare every day, because there were a few times when I wasn't prepared and I made a fool of myself and embarrassed myself in front of professors who I respected. And I said, I'm not doing that again, because they would know when there's 10 people in a class, they would know if you didn't read, because you're getting called on. So you can't hide in a sea of 200 or 1,000 or 500.
So John, about your academic work, this is something I've noticed about you that I think, well, you know, John and I've done a lot of work together, and we just recently did this. Well, we tried to anyway do a special issue to Michelle Serra, but the reviewers were like, no. They were like lizard men, no. So John and I, we were the only ones who got accepted. We were going to have a special issue, which then turned into a symposium. And I'm like, how do two people have a symposium? So I looked it up on I didn't even know what it meant. So I looked it up on Google. It said symposium in Plato's time meant drink lots of beer, get drunk, and talk about philosophy. So I guess that's what we're going to do. But my main point is that, you know, we both always try to break ground, and it's very difficult in these journals because the reviewers are like, no, I don't know what you're doing, whatever. And so I was talking about this book. Look what I found yesterday. Beautiful book, Michelle Serra. And so we're the only two who got accepted. So we're doing this symposium, and it's like,
Out of how many articles? Well, I mean, not that it's a big deal, but 6 articles or so, 7 articles.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
what was the no for?
I don't know. They didn't
Oh,
know. Understand.
There was one guy from UGA who's really good. I really liked his essay. The reviewer said no, and the guy, I said to him, I said, you know, if you do the revisions, they'll at least hear, you know, read it again. He said, nope. He said, I'm not doing this, John. They don't know a damn thing about Sears.
Sears.
Yeah,
Sears.
And so, and then there was, of course, tragedy. There was Peter Trophanis, who was supposed to write that his son died then.
Yeah.
So, and then there was a essay that was not all that good and didn't pass muster from 2 people from Russia. So it's Marla and me.
Well, you guys can talk about it at the collaborative, huh?
Yeah, we could.
Good.
Yeah.
But I guess what the question under the question here is like, okay, so you came from this drill sergeant background, and then you did all this stuff with people on strike and all that radical stuff. But now it's like I see it in your scholarship. It's like, who would do something like try to write an article on Michelle Serra in a conservative philosophy journal? They never heard of them, and they're like, what is that, right? You're always pushing the boundaries. Is that what the drill sergeant taught you, or where did that come from?
No, I think that comes from believe it or not, my history background. You know, when I went from history to education, everything's method in education. And I'm like, what the fuck is that?
Me too. I never understood that.
Yeah.
They would things like the historical method. I was like, what? Then
Yeah.
we talk about historiography, which is great stuff. You know, the history of history writing.
Yeah. Yeah.
That always interested me in history, and it still does. And I told you, Marla, that I decided that I'm going to understand the United States better, understand, you know, read the history of German voting from the Kaiserreich to the present, and the similarities are scary.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, but I still do it, and I enjoy reading this stuff because it's important. And so I always rejected this idea of method because it's too stale, it's too rigid, and it doesn't allow much room for creativity. Where the hell is the creativity when you're writing the same 5-chapter dissertation where the introduction is the first chapter, then the literature review, then the methodology, then the data analysis, then the conclusions? Well, you're overwhelming me with intellectual innovation.
Mhm.
And that's I think we push our students to do something different. And that's why I was so intrigued with hiring Dan. It's good. A filmmaker? Okay, I'm in, you know, because it's different. And we need, and this is why I'm interested in Michel Serres, is because he always did things differently. He always pushed boundaries. And that's why I always also say why the university is conservative. It's methodologically fascist is what the university is.
Mhm.
So, and it's conservative by instinct. There's no radical tenured people at universities for the most part. I always say I'd like to meet them. And so I've always tried to push the envelope. And back to the University of Pittsburgh, I take this class called Education and Culture with Mark Ginsburg, and I was about everything German there. So I did something about German culture, probably dealing with the historical strike, which was the historian strife, where they had a debate about the Holocaust, and which was a serious debate in the 80s.
That's
And
about the comparing
Yeah.
Holocaust to the gulags.
yes, that's
Yeah.
part of it. And it's about discussion about nationalism, which is important. So I probably did something on that, and there was 4 in my group. One was an anthropologist, and she did something in Japan. Another one was a feminist, Diane Brandy, and I wrote about her. She was a go-getter, but she never finished. And then the third person in my group of 4 was Barb Burgess, who was my best friend, and she's teaching at Winthrop, right outside of Charlotte in South Carolina.
South Carolina, yeah.
And so the 4 of us just dominated any class we were in. We controlled the conversation, and there were master students in there. So the last 2 weeks of class, we're presenting our papers, and the last person to speak is this master student who didn't say a damn thing the whole class because he probably wasn't able to because he couldn't get a word in edgewise. And so he talks about, he said, well, I did my paper on the representation of women in television, and I focused on Peg Bundy.
Nice.
I almost fell out of my chair. And I'm like, you could do this?
Right.
And so I talked to Mark about it. And I said, Mark, you could do this type of stuff in academia? He said, well, yeah, you can. That was his way of saying, John, don't do it. You'll ruin your career. And so that, my
Well,
first.
did he know that was the direction of academia, though?
Yeah. No, well, he should, because Colin McCabe was at Pitt. You might have had classes with him, Dan, in the English. He was a big wig in cultural studies in England. And then, he didn't get tenure in England because they said, we have one communist, we don't need 2. And Pitt has this history of hiring people that are outcasts. He was an outcast, and so they hired him in the English department. He brought cultural studies to the University of Pittsburgh.
You know Ron Miller?
No, I know Stephen Miller in reading or writing.
He was part of, he must have come after Colin McCabe. He was part of that cultural studies group in English. And as an undergrad, he really, really focused on me. He gave me a lot of encouragement, to follow up with cultural studies. not that I did right away, but it's something that I think back on and was like, oh wow, that was a guy that really, you know, saw something and encouraged me. And he was someone that blew my mind away, you know, with his lectures and his work, you know, just really, really
Well,
innovative in the way he approached the topic.
so John, when were you at Pitt?
From 90 to 94.
And Dan, when were you there?
The similar time, but I was undergrad and when he was doing his doctoral work. So I was there from probably 90 to 94, you know,
Oh, at the same time?
same time.
And,
I
and
graduated.
not one time did Dan come to my office to say hi.
No.
Well, I'll tell you, speaking of cultural studies, down the road, for people who don't know Pittsburgh, is Carnegie Mellon. And I was there for 2 years, from 80 to 82. And it's so funny because there was this rivalry, right? Carnegie Mellon was, you know, the best. And then Pitt, well, we looked down on you guys because you had a football team, and how gauche is that?
But they sucked when I went there, and so no one cared.
The Pitt Panthers? Are you serious?
They weren't very good. No one really
No.
did any
But
good.
we looked down on Pitt because you had a football team, and well, Carnegie Mellon, you know, we didn't do things like that because that was, you know, too working class or whatever.
You just built robots and competed in that way.
Rockets to destroy people.
Right.
Oh no, I wasn't involved in robotics, but I remember when that started, it was really like weird, you know. Yeah.
Well,
Some
you,
of
well,
my
you know,
roommates went to Carnegie Mellon, like in theater and singing.
That's I was in that building with those people.
Right.
Yeah, I was there the time, I think around the time of Ethan Hawke, and
Yeah.
he did the same thing I did. He dropped out. He hated it, and I'm like, oh, finally, there's someone who dropped out and made it, you know, because I was there for 2 years, and I'm like, it was just music school just ruined me. It was just ruinous, right? And I'm like, oh, finally, Ethan Hawke. He's like, oh, no, this isn't for me. And then he went on to make that movie, The Dead Poets Society. And I'm like, oh, finally, somebody who made it and dropped out of that place. So,
well, there were a lot of famous actors that went to Carnegie
yeah.
Mellon.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Almost
It's a
Hill Street,
factory of-
almost all of Hill Street Blues cast was from Carnegie Mellon.
Right. I remember famous people walking around all the time, you know, with the drama students. But, you know, my department, nobody was famous. Like, we were all like losers. So, I mean,
Well, what was your department? Classical music?
yeah.
I mean, besides Yo-Yo Ma, who's a famous musician, you know, I mean, obviously there are very good ones that are respected within the field, but there aren't.
Well, to be famous in music, in classical music, is like,
yeah,
you know,
like being a famous poet.
like who, right? I mean, there are a lot of people that teach their, you know, are from the Pittsburgh Symphony, but, you know, I mean, who knows? I mean, unless you're in the music business, you don't know who these people are.
Right.
So we didn't have superstars like the drama, the theater department. So
Like curriculum theory.
What's
Like
that?
Curriculum theory.
Yeah, where nobody knows us, right? Interesting.
And so, you know, for me, popular culture was essentially what cultural studies asks is John, talk about your life. You know, life was watching television and going to movies. As it's very much part of our culture. Sports too, of course, is very much part of my culture.
But you know, still, with these publishing houses and the publishing industry, which is something Michelle Serre, you know, rails against, and Walter Ben-Hussein rails against. The same thing today. Talk about your life, and they're like, we don't care about your life. You know, I mean, we don't care about you, and don't write on with the first person I. And you know, and there are still the battles, even with the more liberal presses. It's like, well, why are you using I, or who cares about your story? It's ridiculous.
No, it's that part of that conservatism.
It sure is.
That haunts the university and those establishments that are around and feed off of the university. There's a reluctance to take a risk, and there's no innovation without any risk.
Right. And you know, it all boils down to neoliberalism and capitalism. And the publishing houses say, well, we can't sell this to a library if you talk about your life, so we're pulling your contract.
Yeah,
I've had that said to me, you know.
Really?
Yes, and I've had this struggle my entire career. This is too personal. We don't like your style. You're too personal. Don't talk. Don't use I. This is too conversational. Where's the jargon? We want more jargon. And I'm like, no.
Right.
Right?
You,
Well, who gets hired at publishing houses, right? It's people who
Right.
can edit and they
Right.
can follow the rules and they know where the commas and the semicolons go better than most of us do. And they can't tell the difference between what's good scholarship and what's bad scholarship. So they just
Well,
want scholarship that fits the
but,
pattern that sold before.
But in the old days, they had good editors. 30 years ago, they had good editors. Today, there's so much conglomeration in this publishing house buying that one and swallowing up this one, and it's all about money. And so they get these people who come and go like Michelangelo every 10 minutes. It's a new editor, and so you don't know you don't even know which way the wind's blowing.
yep. And Mary's father was an example of that.
And her mother.
Yeah.
They were both, back in those days, they were prestigious not in academia, but they were prestigious in literature. When editors really meant something, right? It doesn't mean anything anymore. It's a job to catch people plagiarizing, basically. Or,
right.
Oh, this is too much work. The reviewers can't read this. This is too hard. I don't want to read this. Let me polish my nails and write something with a worksheet at the back of it, right?
You're right.
That's really what a lot of it has come down to. It's disgusting.
Right.
So I say we take over the publishing houses.
Well, we have about Joe and Shirley and what they've done with publishing.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Of my 9 books, they've published 6 of them.
Yep. Absolutely.
That maybe 7 of them. My first one was Mark. One I did with Nathan. The edited one was with Routledge Independent. I think the rest of them were Joe and Shirley, and they transformed publishing and education.
They did.
And some people criticize them for making money off of it. I don't. They gave me avenues. They gave me venues.
Me too.
The people, and they didn't say, what's this shit? They said, yeah, do that. That sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right. But isn't that how Bloomsbury started with Virginia Woolf? And I mean, I know they had a lot of money, and there's still a Bloomsbury Press, and it's even bigger now. They have an academic side of Bloomsbury, and they have a trade press. So I mean, you need money to start a publishing house, but boy, is it coming down to us starting our own publishing house? Because that's what I feel like. I mean, I got to such a point where I thought, I'm never going to be able to publish again. I'm just too out in outer space or something, And then boom, I got I always end up with something, but it's like rejection after rejection. I'm like, oh, I can't play this game anymore. Maybe I'm getting too old. Do we have to start our own publishing house? Wouldn't that be great? We could have the Weaver, Chapman, Morris, Bloomsbury publishing house, but you need money to start a publishing house.
Yeah.
It would be nice.
For sure.
Yep.
So, John, so you're talking about, I'm not sure where we were in your story, but you were taking us down.
One was with my endowment.
Yeah.
And then the other one is my intellectual, we've talked about popular culture, but not science or posthumanism. And but with my endowment, going back to Alderson Broaddus College, and you're going to have to do a hell of a lot of editing there, Dan.
The people watching it are going to have to edit in their own head.
Well,
we'll count on them to remember.
I go to this small college. It's a liberal arts college, and I just have a blast. And I'm so thankful that I had this opportunity that I wanted to give back. And so I knew from immediately that whatever money that I made, I was going to give back. And I really thought it was going to be my undergraduate institution. I created a scholarship back in the 90s for one of my professors who introduced me to political philosophy, where we read Plato, Aristotle, St. Augustine, St. Aquinas, Rousseau, and on and on and on. We read, and I was just enthralled with political philosophy. And so created a scholarship with the help of a few other students. I probably contributed about 70% of the amount, and the university rated, or the college rated it. They got rid of it a few years ago, and they lied. They lied to me and said they didn't get rid of it. I said, I'm not giving them any of my money. And so I just went down the line. I said, okay, next alma mater up. And so I started a conversation with Villanova University, where I have a degree, a master's degree in what I call Italian, 19th century Italian and German history, because I had classes in those subjects, and that's what I did my comprehensive exam on. And so, we had about 2-year conversation, and then finally the guy that's in charge of this, he said, I think we're ready to go. I said, I think I am. And so I signed the papers last semester to create this endowment that's going to help assistant professors in French and Italian history, Romance languages, religious studies, and a fourth area. I can't remember now that's listed, that they could go on sabbaticals every year, or do research and travel. And I should be able to give them, with the endowment, about $50,000 a year, and that should be enough for a sabbatical for someone for half a year. So every year, someone at Villanova would be able to go on a sabbatical if they want to do some research.
That's great.
Because the university is my life, and I told this to my 4 children numerous times when they seemed to me to be ungrateful. I said, everything you have is because of education. If I didn't go to Alderson Broaddus College and Wendy didn't go to Alderson Broaddus College, genetically, they don't exist. There's no one else in the world that could have created them.
Mhm.
Because of education that they exist. It's because of my PhD and Wendy's soon-to-be master's degree that they were able to afford things. We're able to entertain the idea of Hannah to go to Duquesne or Pitt, where most families are like, no, stay at home, it's cheaper. Go to community college first. We didn't have to do that. And none of my children will have any debt. And that's just the trap now. Speaking of neoliberalism and the university buying into it, we are indebting in servitude the students and giving them a false image of what the world is by saying, yeah, go into debt, go to college, live it up, because you're never going to live it up again. And it's criminal. And there's someone out there making a lot of money like Betsy DeVos and making money off of students that are going to work hard for the rest of their life and barely afford a home if they can. I didn't want to put my children in that position, and we haven't. So, and Hannah's going to be the same way. She's the last one, and she's going to be able to go wherever she wants, wherever she's earned the right to go. It's not going to be one of these, she plays lacrosse, wink, wink, let her in type of stuff. Yes, and earn it. And so that's the origins of the endowment, and why I wanted to be with TIA rather than go with the state retirement system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, for my intellectual interest, besides popular culture, which was actually my first book, I got a book contract for my dissertation, but I had to compare what was going on in Germany to the United States. And so it took me years to do that, but I got tired of the dissertation too. I said, I got to put it aside. And so I wanted to do something in popular culture because of this paper on Peg Bundy and the representation of women in television. It just fascinated me. And it continues to fascinate me, even though I don't do cultural studies today, because I think in education, too much of it has become plug in new show, plug in new movie, and don't really do much theory. And cultural studies is theory. Stuart Hall teaches us that, and I think we're losing that theory. So I've just moved on to really do science studies. And then, post-humanism in the 90s again. 1996, I go to my first AERA in New York City, and I meet Peter Applebaum, I think a year or two before that. And he introduces me to No Golf, which is another connection to curriculum studies. And he introduces me to Laboratories in Fiction, which is about 120 pages.
I have that book. It's a great book.
Yeah, it's a great book. But you know what? Noel told me a couple of years ago, he said, no one in Australia bought it. No one in Australia reads it. He said, John, if it wasn't for you and Peter and a few other people in America, no one would know I read that book. I wrote that book.
Wow.
I always thought Australia was more progressive than the United States.
Well, never underestimate pettiness and envy.
Well, true enough.
That's an international trait, not an American monopoly. And so we go to New Jersey from New York because a guy named David Shunkin is teaching there, and he worked with Michael Apple, and Matthew Weinstein joins us, and Hank Bromley from SUNY Buffalo. All three worked with Michael Apple. So the five of us go to the New Jersey College of Liberal Arts or something like that, whatever it's called in Trenton, Trenton, in Trenton. And we just spend the day talking about Noel Goff's book. And I'm like, this is great stuff. And so I get interested in popular culture through Peter Applebaum too, who's my first academic friend, because I had a visiting professor.
That was your first friend.
Oh, Peter, you. And so there's a visiting professor named Esther Gottlieb at the University of Pittsburgh, and she taught a class which I sat in on not semantics, but not rhetoric, to linguistics and linguistics. And her husband's Brian McHale, who is the first really postmodern theorist on poetry and literature. And he makes his name, and he gets an endowed chair at WVU. And so she teaches at Pitt. And so she says to me, sometime during the class, she said, you would really like a person I know. You need to meet Peter Applebaum. And I go to, I think it might have been ARA, but no, it couldn't have been, because ARA was the first one was in New York that I went to. It must have been AESA. And I went to his presentation and said, hey, Peter, my name's John Weaver. Esther Gottlieb said I should introduce myself. And we've been friends since. And Peter is a creative person. You can come to him with a problem, and within minutes he'll have 20 solutions for you. And he's all but dissertation PhD mathematics at Duke, and then he went into curriculum studies at University of Michigan because he had a similar experience. The professors there said, "What do you want to do?" "Yeah, take that class, whatever. That's good enough. Okay, stop. You're ready." So. And so that was my interest in popular culture. And then my interest in science starts with Noel Goff and then Catherine Hales. And when I was at Akron, I was involved in the honors department. And so I convinced the headmaster of the honors department to bring in scholars every year. And so Andrew Ross, we brought in Mark Poster, who was an asshole.
He's such a big name.
Yeah, but he was just an ass. And then
you brought in Bell Hooks too, right?
What's that?
Bell Hooks as well, right?
Yeah, and that's a funny story too. I'll tell you that. Robert Rosenstone, who wrote the script for Reds and was a film theorist at Caltech, he came, and then Catherine Hales and Joe Kincheloe was the other one that I brought. And so Catherine Hales was the most gracious person that I've ever met in academia. She worked so well with students, undergraduates and graduates. We spent 2 days together. We had dinner together. We had with a bunch of people, and then we had lunch together. And she's just willing to spend time with people and talk. I mean, she's the one that pushed me to do an edited book on science studies, and that's where Marla, you and I did with Peter. We did postmodern science education. She was really the driving force behind it. And I've been reading her work since, and she's still publishing. She just did a series of Wellick lectures at the Wellick Library at Harvard on the future of print. So she's in her 70s now, and she's still prolific. So that was my introduction to science studies, which I've been reading in since the 90s. Bell Hooks. So Bell Hooks is one of these speakers, and one of my friends, she's in writing at University of Akron. Her name was Sue Hum, and still is. And then she's teaching somewhere in Texas now. And so her and I come together to get Bell Hooks to come to campus. And so, first thing I published on my own was a review essay about Camille Paglia, John Fiske, and Bell Hooks. And so I talk a lot about Bell Hooks in my early writing. And so I was like, yeah, let's get her. And so I was fortunate to meet these people. Andrew Ross was another one who was a really great guy. American Studies pioneer, really. His first book was on poetry, and then he goes into American Studies and really changes the field. and he was really nice. But Catherine Hales was important for me because of science studies. And I continue to write. I think I have one more book in science in me about science in university, and we'll see if that comes out. It usually does. So, and then posthumanism, of course, and that starts with Noel Goff and his work. And I try to pay homage to people that came before me, rather than give the illusion that somehow I'm doing something that's original. You know, the originality comes in how we write, not in the ideas that we have, because we have to come from somewhere. And I come from Noel Goff. And, you know, my lineage in cultural studies would be Bill Dahl first, and then Noel Goff, because Bill Dahl came to my class in Shreveport and, you know, was very gracious too and spoke to my students. And we read his book on postmodern curriculum. And he's the one that told me, like I said, to go to curriculum studies. And you know, at the time was in Tennessee, then then Indiana, then back to Bergamo. And we had a blast. You know this, Marla. We had a blast. You know.
Yeah, we had fun.
Yeah, and all, you know, Wendy would always say, my wife would always say, what you know, why do you go to these conferences but you never go to sessions? I said,
That's true. John never went to sessions. He would always be in the, like, where the lounge area was. But that's what you really learn. You learn in the lounge. You learn in the hallways.
Right.
that's where I met Eugenia Whitlock and talked. And, you know, that's where Toby and I concocted a lot of our ideas. A lot of my books came from there, the book ideas. Of the 9 books that I wrote, 8 of them were originally my idea. Yours, Marla, the Holocaust was your idea, the Holocaust book.
Yeah, difficult memories. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and, you know, with Nathan, I can't remember now if it was Nathan or me. So at least 7 of my books were my ideas. And I just wanted to work with other people. And so I do have this history of working with other people, not because I had to, because I wanted to. And, you know, I have to do my own thing too. That's why I have 4 books that are my own, and journal articles and book chapters, but I wanted to do work with other people too. And that's always been something that I've done, starting with Toby. And Toby was an accident too. The original person who was supposed to edit the book, with the popular culture book with me, didn't do his work. And so I finally said, give me the stuff and I'll do it. And through Patrick Slattery, I met Toby because Toby was Patrick's student. And so we took off and we wrote quite a number of things together over the first 6-8 years of my academic career.
Yeah, Toby and Denise Taliaferro in our last podcast and me, we were all in this class together at LSU on cognition. And Bill Piner said, you know, I'm really sorry, but you have to take this class. And then I saw what he meant. And so Toby did like our final presentations. He did the spoken word thing, and Denise did her spoken word thing. And I don't remember what I did, but the guy teaching the class said, man, what's with you curriculum studies people? You're like into this performance stuff.
Yeah.
So that's where I met Toby.
Yeah. Toby and I had a deal at Bergamo. Let's never see the sun until we leave. We slept during the day and partied all night.
Oh, wait, well, those were sometimes. Huh? I mean, ooh, man, that's Louisiana mentality brought to Dayton, Ohio.
Yep.
Into a monastery in Dayton, Ohio.
Yeah, but you don't know, priests and monks drink a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, they would come into Bergamo and say, and you think you're professionals? We'll show you.
I remember when I was at Loyola as a master's student, they used to have a bar on campus. Like, they don't do that anymore. They had a bar on campus called the Wolf Den, or the Wolf, because I don't know what their thing was, a wolf thing, right? Then you drink with the priests, you know? And then they got rid of that, but I mean, because that was New Orleans, and the priests drank a lot.
Yeah.
Wine, they make wine, right? With the grapes.
Yeah, they make beer.
And a good beer, yeah.
Martin Luther, for God's sakes, was an alcoholic.
Yeah, he drank 600 gallons of beer. Wait, what was it? Is that right? A day? Wait.
Oh, I don't.
I'd have to hallucinate.
Yeah. I read his biography recently, and he was a raving drunk, and that's when he became.
It was 6 gallons of beer a day. And then he said, there are devils on the rain pipe. I'm like, dude, you're hallucinating from the beer.
Devil's in your liver.
And he's the founder of Protestantism, and he's hallucinating devils on a rain pipe. I'm like, dude.
Yep. And a raving anti-Semite.
Well, we know that. Yeah.
But
Who was it?
he was a raving anti-Semite, and he was actively involved getting nuns out of the nunnery and getting them married. So he was a revolutionary anti-Semite.
Mhm.
Oh, well, I can go into that. I'm not going to go into that, but I'm not, never mind. That's for another time. Yes, he was.
Yep. Yeah. And those, by the way, I did 2 years of catechism in the Lutheran Church because that's what Lutherans did. That never came up.
2 years of what?
Catechism.
What's that? Oh, catechism. I thought you said panicism, like having panic attacks.
Well, if you see devils on the roof, you're going to have a panic attack.
When was that?
Rain pipe.
7th and 8th grade year.
Okay.
We met every weekend for 2 years. And one of the things you had to do too is to go to a Catholic service.
Mm-hmm.
And I met a guy years ago as an undergraduate then. He said, what's the difference between a Lutheran and a Catholic is your priest can marry. That's true.
Is it all in Latin in Lutheran?
No, not for us. Some of it was, I'm sure, was in German at some time.
German, not Latin, German. Martin Luther, German.
Well, I was just thinking the similarities with Catholicism. That's what.
Yeah, there's, of the similarities, and a lot of it myth and a lot of made up shit. But that's religion.
Mm.
Aren't the Lutherans more like Bergman-ish strict, like Fanning Alexander, like really strict?
Oh, you have ascetic. Nietzsche railed against ascetic Christians, and he was talking about Luther.
Yeah,
he was talking.
Lutherans, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a strand in my life because the work ethic that I got from my working class family, that comes from being ascetic Lutherans. You work.
Right. Dan and I were talking about that before you came on. I said, we're all really Americans are really all Protestants because we have this work ethic. Well, maybe not the South, but we have a work ethic, and that work ethic actually comes out of Protestantism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But also fascism comes out of Protestantism too.
Correct. And that's too bad.
There's a dark side and a light side.
Mm-hmm.
And then the lasers.
But that becomes one of our challenges as academics is, where do we see the light? How do we focus on something? Or, Michelle Sayers talks about, we can learn something from darkness as well, and it's not just about coming out of darkness, but what do we learn in darkness?
Mm-hmm.
We can learn in both light and darkness.
Well, it's interesting. The Catholic priest who got kicked out of the church for writing a book called Original Blessing, Matthew Fox, and then he became Episcopalian. He said, I saw him one time at a, I don't know, he was giving a talk, maybe it was at Loyola, and he said, where there's too much light, beware. That's a cult.
Yeah, no kidding. That's for true.
Yeah, because they're obsessed with purity.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And nothing good out of purity, except for.
Right.
You cut out there except for what?
Except for death.
Yeah.
What about death?
That comes out of purity.
Yeah.
What, dying?
No. Killing comes out of purity.
I get what you're talking about.
You're not pure enough. Your ideas aren't pure enough. You're not Republican enough. So
Right.
we got to.
You're grotesque.
Right.
Yeah.
Degenerate is the word they used in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
So how would you want to be remembered, John, after 9 books and a lifetime of scholarship?
Well, of course, that's a good question because it's something that we should all be thinking about because, my background is Christian, but Christianity has lost its way. I'm not interested in it anymore. I think it's bullshit. I don't believe in this myth of heaven and hell. we're dead, period. I'm done. I'm gone. I'm no more. I don't even know I'm dead when I'm dead.
You're more Jewish than you are Christian in that respect.
Yeah, and
Reformed.
I'm that. Um, and so I spend a lot of time thinking about what will my legacy be. And of course, I go back to that wonderful series of last interviews. And Jacques Derrida says, I don't know. That's not up to me. And he's right. We don't know what our heritage. The only thing we can do is leave things behind us. And that's why I wanted to create an endowment, that I wanted something to be left behind, and not squandered. There's a poem by a poet named Paul Miller, and he's talking about, it's a fictitious Paul Miller in the poem. His father dies outside of the state. His car was at an airport, so Paul Miller has to go to the airport to pick up his dad's car, and he calls his dad's car, my future mortgage payments. And I said, that's not happening to me. I'm not going to be squandered away, and it's going to be dust to dust. Who the hell was John Weaver? And so I want some kind of legacy to exist in the books, or some way. There's going to be someone 100 years from now, hopefully, that will go by a library and just browse and say, oh, look, John Weaver. That's a remembering of my name. And if they pick it up, they're picking up and touching a part of me, just like they do anyone else. Now, the problem with academia, it's always, what have you done lately? And so, we have a very short attention span. And I think part of that is needed. Another part of that is envy that says, whatever it is, I'm going to erase, and I can do it better and pretend that I'm the first to do it. Mm-hmm. And so, that's one of the reasons why I tried to pay homage to people that came before me, because I want people to remember Nogoff, and important things that he left behind, when he's no longer with us. It's the same thing with me, and with anyone. And maybe that's one of the reasons why I like to do work with other people, because it's spreading out of the tree of life. And so my first answer is I don't know how I'm going to be remembered, but I'm leaving traces behind to leave the potential of being remembered. Recently in forums, and one of the reasons why I am teaching forums now in the last couple of years is I've been pushing students to do 3 projects for dissertations. One, I tell them, Bill Schubert needs a dissertation done about him. A second one is, I said, this is fraught with minefield. I said, a dissertation needs to be done on our dissertation or our doctoral program. I said, the problem is who you're going to get to be the chair, because we're all involved in the program. But the third person is, I tell them, is Mary Dahl. She needs to have a dissertation done on her. Mm-hmm. None of our students have taken me up on it, but I'm going to keep on pushing until I, stop teaching that class, because I think those things need to be done, because these people, their work is worthy of being studied.
So,
well, okay, I gotta go, guys.
All right.
Okay.
Wrap it up. Great talking with you, John. Thank you, Dan.
All right.